Joining me now is the FCPS Director of Government Relations, Michael Molloy. Michael, welcome.
Thank you.
So your website is just fantastic. I got to tell you, I went and poked around looking at some things just to make sure I was, you hear things on the radio, I want to make sure I'm right. Is that what I heard? And the website's great, so thank you for all that good work.
Absolutely.
It would be easier to say what's new, but what were the challenges going into this Senate or this session that you knew about?
Well, you knew you'd have an interesting session because you're walking in the door with a 20-20 partisan split in the Senate, but with the Lieutenant Governor being a Republican holding the tie-breaking vote. So you knew there would be kind of a division with that. You knew coming in that the governor's budget had some challenges built into it, particularly for Northern Virginia. There were some cuts that would have hit Northern Virginia school divisions fairly hard that came out of the governor's budget. And then the governor had a very extensive, to use his term, education reform agenda coming into the session. So there was a lot on the table for the General Assembly to try and digest. And as you know, the General Assembly sessions, they have a fairly limited amount of time to do an awful lot of work, so it moves fast.
Okay. Let's put the reform stuff aside and talk about budget first.
Okay.
How did it turn out? Give us some kind of bottom line figures, and what are some concerns? What are some things that look good?
The bottom line is the budget's much improved over what we started with. There was a cut that would have hit Northern Virginia localities particularly hard called the cost of competing. It's a pot of money that's sent back to Northern Virginia because of the unique wage market that we work in, that we're competing with the Northrop Grummons and the private industries where salaries are fairly substantial. And for us to compete as a school system, we need to have competitive salaries ourselves. And this would have affected the supplement that the state sent back for support personnel. That was mostly restored for the 2013 budget, and it was partially restored for 2014. Remember, when the General Assembly has a budget session, they do a biennial budget. So they set their budget for the next 2 years, not just for the next year.
One of the budget items that matters to FCPS employees and also the community at large is the VRS or retirement system. I know it's complicated, but can you try and boil it down for us?
There's a couple things. One, there's the budgetary impact. Anytime VRS rates, the amount of money that school systems have to send in to cover the cost for their employees, anytime that goes up, that has a direct impact on our budget. And this year it did. When the governor introduced his budget, the rates had gone up fairly substantially, so that the school system started in a fairly large hole. On top of the rates, the General Assembly and the governor also considered some fairly extensive changes to the VRS system, most of which probably aren't going to affect current employees, but by 2014, you're going to move from what they call a defined benefit plan, which is just a traditional pension, to a more hybrid defined benefit and then defined contribution. So you'll have some aspects of the traditional pension, some aspects of what you'd think of as a 401k or something like that. That, as I said, that doesn't affect current employees, but that will affect other employees going forward. One other thing that they did do was the state had instituted a 5%, they had shifted 5% of the contribution to employees. Right. They did the same thing for teachers and for local government employees this year, but that's offset by a required 5% increase in salaries. So in some ways it will end up being a wash. It actually doesn't end up being a wash from the school system's perspective. Right. We have some additional costs that come along with that, but from an employee's perspective, it ends up being fairly close to what they would expect to see without the change.
Right. With most things, the calculus becomes very complicated. Social Security, all those other things.
Absolutely.
Correct?
Yeah, it all kind of snowballs on itself.
Accreditation and virtual schools. Tell us what happened there.
With accreditation in virtual schools, it's interesting that the state is really moving towards an emphasis on virtual education. The governor had a fairly extensive set of reforms for diplomas, and one of the components of the changes to the diplomas is there will now be a requirement for every student to have taken at least one virtual course during their high school career. In addition to that, there's also a big push for virtual education programs in general, not just an individual course, but an actual program where kids are at home taking their courses, and they may be an FCPS student taking an FCPS virtual program, or they may be an FCPS student taking a virtual program somewhere else in the state or somewhere else in the United States. You lose your boundaries when you start talking about virtual education. But that was one of the big themes.
And this ties into diplomas, correct?
Absolutely. As I said, the one diploma change for every student will be a requirement to have a 1 credit virtual course. A lot of flexibility, a lot of different options will be available for kids. The other big change for diplomas was for standard diploma seekers. I believe it's the 2013, for ninth graders, starting in 2013, 2014, they will be required to complete not a sequence, but a kind of an industry certification. So a career and technical education certification, it can be something as elaborate as an entire CTE program, or it can be something as simple as passing an exam.
We're running out of time, but there are a couple things on your radar screen for next year already.
Oh, absolutely. We have perennial issues, school calendar being one of them. Actually, we're successful getting the school calendar bill out.
Went farther than ever.
Made it out of the House, but died in a Senate committee. That didn't go anywhere.
Teacher contracts.
Teacher contracts as well. It was a big push to change teacher contracts from a continuing contract to a more term type thing. It didn't pass this year, but I'm not going to be surprised to see it come back.
Very good. Well, thanks for your time.
Absolutely.